where we left off, before the break, we were talking about the typical forms of literature that comprise the Bible text. And so the question that we'll use to open this next session here is this: if we could know all about the Bible passage's original setting, if we could understand everything there is to know about its original place in life, its Sitz-in-Leben, what would that do for us? What would be the advantage for that? If we could understand the things that form criticism is going to offer us, first of all, we would discover original units of the tradition that we now find in the biblical literature. What we have in the Bible is not the original tradition. The original tradition is what inspired and gave rise to what is found in the Bible itself now. The second thing is that it would establish the history of these units. So again, we're looking at the literary and the historical aspects of the form-critical study of the Bible. Why are these things important? Why is the literature of the Bible important? And why must we understand the textual backgrounds to it? And why is the cultural history and social history so important for us? Well, in the case of the synoptics, the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, form criticism moves from the existing text, what we actually have when we're reading our Bibles, and you can just keep those handy right there with you, because not all of the class members have had the advanced Greek readings. We'll use the English translation in this particular case, even though we used our Greek New Testaments earlier. What we're going to do is we're going to find that we can have our biblical text and move back in time to an earlier stage that presumably no longer exists. That earlier stage consisted of discrete sayings and some larger stories that can be classified by the form of their literature. Now, the traditions conveyed by those forms served the needs and the purposes of the early church. They had relevance to the internal and external problems confronting the Christian community, and those problems, of them there were many. So the third thing that it will do for us, other than discover the original units of tradition that are in the biblical literature and establish the history of these units, it will also provide for us an analysis of those traditions, the sayings and stories. We'll be able to analyze those with a method. We can uncover the sitz-im-leben, or setting in life, in which these traditions arose and then were handed on to subsequent generation of Christians. Thus, again, form criticism is both a literary and a historical operation. Now let's consider some of the forms in the New Testament. And you'll need your outline here to follow along. And we're proceeding with the understanding that all members of the class have done their homework. If not, some of this will seem a little bit confusing, but so I'm assuming that everybody's done their pre-class work. Some of the forms that you see there in your list, number one are the discourse forms, and we're sticking with the New Testament here. Discourse forms. I'll mention just a few. I won't give you all of them that are in your list there, but in the Synoptic Gospels, one very common form is the discourse form, which simply relates the sayings, the idioms, expressions, and concepts expressed by or attributed to Jesus. That is discourse. Now, one kind of discourse form is called the Apophthegm. The Apophthegm. In some classes, you'll hear them describe this as the conflict saying, that it's a discrete saying of Jesus, usually couched within a story involving some sort of conflict. In your notes, the PH here is not in there. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. It's a saying set in a brief narrative. An example of an apophthegm is Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. And so let's consider that, and we'll turn to Mark chapter 3. And I'll simply read these 6 verses. Mark chapter 3, first 6 verses. Again he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. And they watched him to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Now let's consider this. The whole story revolves around the saying in verse 4, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" That's the center of this. That's the discrete saying. That in itself is the Apophthegm. It's a question that Jesus is asking, but it's a rhetorical question, obviously. Now, it's a piercing question that really serves to expose the pettiness of Jesus' opponents, and then it provides justification for Jesus to go on and heal on the Sabbath. In doing that, Jesus is reinterpreting the law of Moses. He's showing that he is transcendent of, or superior, or preeminent over the law. And in one sense, this particular narrative functions as the vehicle for the saying. And the interpreter at least must consider that the saying once existed independently, "Is it lawful?" And then that the story, with its synagogue, withered hand, Pharisees, and others, the miracle has been sort of constructed to give the story context and power. So the center of this isn't the miracle. The center of this is the Apophthegm. Is it lawful? But what is more important, we continue to ask some of the questions of the text that we've been asking. What kind of community would have found this type of saying interesting, or meaningful, or memorable and powerful enough to want to pass it on to their next generation? Well, since the Sabbath observance would have been most interesting to Jews and not to Gentiles, and since the Gospel of Mark was finally composed in large part for Gentile Christians, you can see Mark chapter 7, verses 3 and 4 for that, it's unlikely that Mark would have invented a story that had so little meaning for a Gentile audience. So we're not going to assume that this was invented. But the story revolves around the observance or non-observance of the Sabbath. Now, that would have been a very important issue for the church that existed in a heavily Jewish environment, at least where Judaism had set the cultural patterns, and the early church had to then explain its rather free attitude towards Sabbath observance. So the Christians are a minority in an overwhelmingly Jewish kind of context. So this Apophthegm, and most others, probably reflects the debate between Palestinian Jews and Jewish Christians about the early church's practice and theology. The story serves to anchor the free attitude of the church regarding the Sabbath in the teaching and example of the earthly Jesus. So we're simply asking these questions of the text and suggesting interpretive directions based on the literary and historical concerns that arise in the study of the particular form. We want to know its place in life, how it was used, like my guideposts, articles that I might read, when and where it's used, and what effect does it have on the readership? Where and among whom did the biblical text have meaning? What was the meaning for them? And how does that help us in our interpretation? Well, we'll mention a few others on your list there. Another kind is of discourse form is the proverb, a brief saying of Jesus expressing a general axiomatic kind of truth of a practical or perhaps a moral nature. For example, Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, Jesus said, "No one can serve two masters." Now, that's a very general kind of saying in that it communicates a truth of a general experience, and it elicits the response from its readers or hearers, "Hey, that's right. How could you serve two masters? Both want different kinds of expectations from you." And so the context, that is, the Sermon on the Mount, within the Gospel, the Synoptic Gospel, shows that the early church was bringing a spiritual meaning to that very simple saying. But there were certainly other reasons for that. They did not just want to know a spiritual meaning to a saying. they had used it in particular ways and in particular situations. Another one is a nuanced form of the proverb called the proverbial imperative, which expresses the truth in the form of a commandment. For example, continuing on in Matthew chapter 6, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow has enough concerns of its own. Now, what a wonderful truth that is. So simple, so memorable, and so very useful and practically relevant and applicable to our everyday life. Another one would be the interrogative proverb. That's a form that stimulates thought and urges a response from the hearer when Jesus is asking a question. So continuing on in Matthew 6, which of you, by being anxious, can add even 1 cubit to his span of life? Well, these kinds of proverbs were so common, but they lack a specific kind of setting. You couldn't find them specifically in the temple or particularly in a particular kind of setting in the history of ancient Judaism or of the growing Christian church. These could be used in and out of the church, but they're showing that Jesus is the great wisdom teacher. And so these are simple, pithy kinds of sayings that could be used in the marketplace, in the city square, or among friends in the narrow streets of their town, or in the villages, or especially in the fields, or the workplace. But there are other apophthegms, or sayings, prophetic, apocalyptic, legal, and others, and your outline has the descriptions of those, as does your reading required for this week. A few more. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom. In Matthew chapter 7. There's a prophetic element to that Jesus goes on with. Jesus' words about the judgment and end times have apocalyptic elements in the apophthegm. Consider, for example, his statement, that one, not dressed appropriately for the wedding party, must be thrown out where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And again, there's an apophthegm at the center of these stories, and they're couched within a very memorable kind of narrative. Or how about this one dealing with law? When you give alms, and do not kill. These are legal kinds of sayings. How were these sayings circulating, and how were they being used prior to their collection in the Gospels as we have them now? So that's one. The narrative form is seen in the different stories about Jesus. So we'll talk about another form, the narrative form. Having discussed these discrete sayings, usually the narrative forms begin with a kind of setting. Again, there's a structure to the form. Here's one. A leper came to him, saying, make me clean. Or in another case, it begins, afterwards, he said to them, let's get into the boat and cross over to the other side. And of course, that story concludes, who then is this that the wind and waves obey him? That's the short, discrete saying. Who then is this? A kind of interrogative question that the disciples are asking among themselves, and that you and I can ask among ourselves. The miracle story is common, but there are others. There's parables. There's the epistolary form, the form of the letter, where we're reading other people's mail. There's the doxology. There's the kerygma, which is a sermon or brief summary of the Christian message. There's the hymn formula. There's the catalog of vices that we find. There's the list of virtues and the Hausstaffeln, or so-called house rules, that we find several times in the epistles. All of these have standardized, formulaic, or stereotypical forms readily identifiable by their original readers, with a life setting and a particular kind of usage that was intended by the author and then received, and perhaps new life was breathed into it through several generations. And now we have them in a literary form, in a textual form in the biblical literature. And we can make interpretive judgments about the text based on that literary form. Each form has unique and very specific elements and function as units of tradition that sort of set them apart as a particular kind and that suggest directions for interpretation. One more brief example will suffice, and then we'll wrap up our time together for this hour. We'll go to Philippians chapter 2. We'll pick an epistle this time. Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, is a pre-Pauline hymn, a hymn to Jesus, that says, "Who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God something to be grasped." So let's sort of cut that out and lift that out momentarily. Philippians 2, 6 through 11. It's understood that Paul did not compose or invent this particular hymn. It's not his hymn. He's incorporating the pre-existing hymn into his letter, a hymn to the Christ. Now, many other hymnic fragments are found throughout the epistles. Paul draws on them. We find them elsewhere. The hymn was a very common form with very typical and readily identifiable elements and units. Many centuries of parallel and comparative examples that illustrate context and life setting can be found. An entire section, for example, is included in the ancient Near East texts by Pritchard, which most of you have when you took Old Testament from me. And these hymns were used in very specific liturgical contexts as doxological and liturgical praises that arise from the spiritual status and condition, from the heart of the praiser, of the worshiper, extolling her or his deity and praising, honoring that deity for great things done. It's no wonder then, and it certainly would have been quite natural, that they would have taken that hymn form and then applied it to their situation in the early Christian church. So is it remarkable that such a liturgical tradition had already been established and presented in Paul's letter to the church at Philippi, with an apparent assumption that the Christ hymn was already in use perhaps there and perhaps well known elsewhere in the Christian world, and that patterns of worship were already established before the year 53 or perhaps 55. That's the range I'm giving to the date range I'm giving to the writing of Paul's letter to the church at Philippi. And so many things can be extrapolated from the textually unknown life of the first Christians, that they had a liturgical tradition already established within a generation of the death, resurrection, and ascension of Christ. Well, this week, some members of a different religion came to my house. They visited my home, and I invited them in. And I always enjoy visiting with these folks. There's several different ones that come by every now and then. And they offered me some reading material that was focused on anti-Trinitarian polemic that portrayed a view of God that really minimized the incarnation and explained away the deity of Christ as an invention of these early Christians that we've been discussing, and an invention of the early church. Well, I informed them that although I am very respectful and certainly tolerant of different opinions, and I invite different opinions, and am interested in sharing mine and hearing theirs, nevertheless, the New Testament, I explained, clearly sets forth a Trinitarian theology that exalts Jesus Christ as the eternal God in the flesh, the incarnation. And then using their own translation, they have sort of retranslated the Bible into a form that best suits their own theology. I took their translation and showed them in Philippians 2, verses 6 through 11, that there was this early Christian liturgy, earlier than the writing of the New Testament, that's coming to us through the letter that Paul writes to the Philippians. And I briefly discussed a very simple form critical theory, and then I asked for their response to the first Christian's liturgy. If indeed there was not a praise to the Christ as God, then how do you explain your presuppositions? And I simply asked for their opinion, and as you can imagine, I was unable to inspire further inquiry and reflection on the deity of Christ. They did not want to deal with that, and my visitors ended our conversation abruptly and left rather quickly. Well, these critical approaches to the study and interpretation of the New Testament, I believe, will enrich your own faith in Christ and enrich your appreciation and love of the Scriptures. And it will help you bring to life the purpose of the Bible, as we've already said, so that you all may know and believe in Jesus. 21st century readers who are unaware of or disregard the literary conventions particular to the various text forms in their study of the New Testament run the risk of missing some wonderful insights for interpretation, or worse, risk serious misinterpretation of the Bible itself.